There is a question historians rarely ask about Genghis Khan, not how many people he killed, not how far his armies rode, not even how a child born into poverty on the Mongolian steppe became the ruler of the largest contiguous land empire in human history. The question they rarely ask is this: how did he pay for it? Because here is what most people don't understand about conquest at scale. Armies don't move on courage. They move on calories, on horses, on arrows, on the quiet, unglamorous infrastructure of supply and credit and organizational genius. Every empire that tried to cross the same distances the Mongols crossed, the Persians under Cyrus and Darius, the Greeks under Alexander, the Romans at the height of their expansion, eventually hit a wall. Not a wall of enemy soldiers, a wall of logistics, a wall of cost. The further you go, the thinner your supply lines become. The longer your campaign, the more expensive every additional mile. At some point, the mathematics of sustaining an army in the field simply breaks down, and every conqueror in history, no matter how brilliant, has been forced to stop. Genghis Khan didn't just break through that wall. He redesigned it. He turned the machinery of logistics into a weapon, and he turned terror into a financial instrument. And the story of how he did that is, in many ways, the most important story of the medieval world, and one of the most overlooked in modern historical education. This is not a story about barbarism. It is a story about systems. And like all the best stories about systems, it begins with a single person who understood the system he was born into and decided to build a better one. His name, before history gave him another one, was Temujin. Born around 1162 on the steppes of what is now Mongolia, he entered the world into a landscape that was, by any measure, brutally competitive. The Mongolian steppe is not a romantic wilderness. It is one of the harshest operating environments on Earth. A vast grassland subject to extreme temperatures, unpredictable weather, and a carrying capacity for a human population that is, by the standards of agricultural civilizations, extraordinarily low. The clans that lived on it competed constantly for pasture, water, and livestock. Wealth was measured in horses and sheep. Power was measured in the number of men who owed you a debt they could not repay any other way than with their lives. His father, Yasuge, was a minor tribal chief with enough standing to arrange a marriage alliance for his son, but not enough to protect his family from rivals. When Temujin was around 9 years old, Yasuge was poisoned by Tatar enemies at a roadside meal, and with his death, the family's social position collapsed almost immediately. The clan that had followed Yasuge abandoned his widow and children, refusing to be led by a woman and a boy, unwilling to accept the risk of sheltering a family with powerful enemies and no protector. Temujin, his mother Holon, and his siblings were left to survive alone on the steppe with minimal resources. For years, they lived on roots, berries, and whatever small game they could catch. He was captured and enslaved by a rival clan. He escaped. He built alliances, carefully and deliberately, trading loyalty for loyalty, protection for protection. What Temujin learned during those years is rarely discussed in the context of economic or political history, but it should be. What he was absorbing, at the granular level that only lived experience can teach, was a deep understanding of how power worked on the steppe. He was learning how alliances were made and broken, how loyalty was purchased through gift-giving and demonstrated strength, how a man with nothing could accumulate obligation. He was learning that the steppe's political economy ran on a currency that was not silver or gold, but credibility. And that credibility, unlike material wealth, could be built from scratch by anyone willing to do what was necessary to establish it. The steppe was a market. A harsh, often lethal market, but a market nonetheless. And Temujin was learning to read it with the precision of someone whose life depended on getting the analysis right. By the time he began consolidating power in the 1180s and 1190s, he was not operating on instinct alone. He was operating on a theory of political economy that, had it been written down by a contemporary scholar, would have looked remarkably modern. Loyalty was not assumed. It was bought, structured, and enforced. Defeated enemies who submitted were absorbed rather than destroyed. Their fighters converted from liabilities into assets, their resentment managed through integration and shared stakes in future success. The psychological mechanism here was precise. Submission was rewarded visibly, resistance was annihilated visibly, and the gap between those two outcomes was made as wide as possible, so that every chieftain within hearing distance of his reputation could perform the calculation clearly and arrive at the same rational conclusion. This was not brutality in the casual, undirected sense. This was incentive design. By 1206, the year the Great Assembly of Mongolian chiefs, the Kurotai, proclaimed him Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, he had already accomplished something that no one on the steppe had ever managed to sustain. He had unified the fractious, perpetually warring tribes of Mongolia into a single political and military entity. This was not a small thing. The steppe had produced great warriors before. It had never produced a unified state, because the centrifugal forces of tribal loyalty, kinship obligation, and competition for resources had always, eventually, pulled every coalition apart. Genghis Khan eliminated those centrifugal forces by destroying their foundations. And critically, he replaced them with something that would prove far more durable: a new economic logic. The old logic was tribal. Wealth flowed within bloodlines. Military obligation followed kinship. Promotion came through birth. If your father was a chief, you might become a chief. If your father herded cattle, you herded cattle. The system was stable because everyone understood it, but it was also rigid because it made no use of the talent that existed outside the aristocratic lines. And it meant that any leader's death created an automatic succession crisis. Genghis Khan abolished the entire structure. He reorganized his army, and by extension, his entire society, on a decimal system. Units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, each commanded by an officer chosen on the basis of demonstrated competence and personal loyalty to the Khan. Officers were not born, they were appointed, and they could be removed. A general who won was rewarded with wealth, status, and expanded command. A general who lost without sufficient cause was punished. A commander who disobeyed a direct order in the field was executed, without exception and without regard for his family connections. Loot, the primary currency of Mongol warfare, was distributed according to clear, pre-established rules. Soldiers knew, before a campaign began, what their share of the proceeds would be. Officers knew their share. The Khan knew his. The widows and children of soldiers killed in service received a share as well, a detail that is easy to overlook, but that had profound implications for recruiting and for morale. Fighting for Genghis Khan was not just an obligation. It was an investment with a knowable expected return. This restructuring of the steppe's entire incentive architecture was, in the language of modern organizational theory, a profound shift from a feudal principal-agent problem to something closer to a performance-based employment contract. For the first time, a man born with nothing had a clear and rational reason to fight as hard as possible, because the reward for fighting well was real, predictable, and not determined by who his grandfather was. The Mongol army was, in this sense, one of history's earliest large-scale meritocracies. And meritocracy, when applied to violence, is extraordinarily efficient. But the army still had to eat. It still needed arrows, replacement horses, siege equipment, intelligence about enemy positions, lines of communication that could survive the chaos of a campaign. The question of how to fund perpetual expansion across the largest landmass on Earth was still, at its core, a financial problem that no amount of meritocratic restructuring could solve on its own. And Genghis Khan's answer to that financial problem is where the story becomes genuinely remarkable. The first piece of the solution was plunder, but plunder understood and organized as a managed financial system, not as spontaneous chaos. When the Mongols sacked the city, what followed was not simply a mass of soldiers helping themselves to whatever they could carry. The distribution of the proceeds was organized, cataloged, and allocated according to a hierarchy of obligation. The Khan received his share, typically 1/5 of all movable wealth, a tithe on violence. Senior commanders received theirs. Soldiers received theirs according to rank and performance. The families of the fallen received theirs. And a portion was always reinvested in the war chest, allocated to the costs of the next campaign. The horses, the arrows, the provisions, the intelligence networks that made the next conquest possible. This was not looting. This was revenue recognition, applied to military operations with a precision that most medieval states could not achieve in their peacetime tax systems. The Mongols were, functionally, running a business. The product was territorial control. The revenue was extracted from conquered populations. The capital expenditure was the army, and the retained earnings were reinvested in further expansion. The second piece of the solution was the ordic system, and this is where Genghis Khan's financial sophistication moves from impressive to genuinely extraordinary. The ordic were merchant partners, largely Central Asian, Persian, and Muslim traders who operated across the steppe and the sedentary civilizations at its edges. They provided upfront capital to Mongol military campaigns in exchange for a contractually specified share of the profits from conquest and, crucially, for guaranteed trading privileges through newly controlled territory. The Khan's protection was real and enforceable. A merchant traveling under Mongol safe conduct could cross thousands of miles of otherwise dangerous territory with a reasonable expectation of arriving alive. In the language of modern finance, the ordic were venture capitalists. The Mongol campaign machine was their portfolio. They were not donating to a cause. They were making a calculated investment in an enterprise with a track record of delivering exceptional returns. These merchants understood something that the sedentary powers of the era, the Jin dynasty in northern China, the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia, the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, fundamentally failed to grasp. Mongol military expansion was not random destruction. It was route clearing. Every city the Mongols brought under their control became a node on a trade network that was being rebuilt, more efficiently, more safely, under Mongol administration. The merchant who financed the campaign didn't merely receive a cut of the plunder. He received access to the Silk Road. He received a monopoly position in a newly integrated market that had previously been fragmented by warfare, by competing tariff systems, by the general insecurity of pre-Mongol Central Asia. This partnership between military power and merchant capital was one of the most sophisticated financial innovations of the medieval world. It meant that the Mongol expansion was never purely extractive. It was, from the very beginning, a joint investment in infrastructure. Violent infrastructure, yes, but infrastructure nonetheless. The merchants needed the Mongols to clear the routes. The Mongols needed the merchants to finance the clearing. The relationship was symbiotic, and it was one of the primary engines that allowed the Mongol expansion to sustain itself across distances and timescales that had defeated every previous attempt at continental empire. The third piece of the solution was the yam, and it may be the most underappreciated logistical achievement of the medieval world. The yam was the Mongol relay system, a network of postal stations spaced roughly 25 to 30 miles apart across the entire empire, each one stocked with fresh horses, food, shelter, and trained riders available around the clock. A message could travel from one end of the empire to the other at speeds that would not be matched by any comparable communication system for centuries. Military orders moved faster than the news of the invasion. Diplomatic correspondence moved faster than the armies themselves. Trade goods moved on predictable schedules that allowed merchants to plan and price accordingly. For an empire built on speed, and the Mongol military advantage was, at its core, a speed advantage, The yam was the central nervous system. It transformed the Mongol Empire from a collection of separately moving armies into something more like a single coordinated organism, capable of responding to events on its periphery faster than those events could develop into crises. But the yam had an economic dimension that is easy to miss when you focus on its military function. The system was not free. It was maintained through a specific tax, the yam tax, levied on the populations under Mongol control. Communities along the relay routes were required to provide horses, provisions, and labor on a rotating basis. This tax was paid not primarily in money, but in kind, in the specific material inputs the system needed to function. What this meant was that the communication infrastructure of the empire was self-financing through the territories it served. The conquered populations were not merely passive subjects paying tribute to a distant power. They were embedded as functional components in the logistical machine that maintained the empire. They were stakeholders in the system's operation, because the system's operation was literally their tax obligation. This was how the Mongols solved the classic problem of imperial overextension, the problem that had destroyed Alexander's empire, that had stretched Rome past its limits, that would eventually unravel every attempt at continental governance before the telegraph era, not by reducing the size of the empire, but by making the empire itself generate the resources needed to sustain its own administration. The yam was both a communication tool and a taxation mechanism, and the genius of combining those two functions was that each reinforced the other. Now we come to the part of the story that most histories struggle to contextualize honestly: the destruction, the burning of cities, the mass killings, the deliberate, systematic erasure of populations that resisted Mongol authority. Estimates of the total death toll from the Mongol conquests range enormously, from tens of millions to as many as 40 million across the entire span of Mongol expansion. These figures are contested by historians and are genuinely difficult to verify given the state of medieval demographic records. But even the most conservative estimates represent one of the largest episodes of deliberate mass violence in human history. The populations of entire regions, Khorasan in northeastern Persia, the Rus principalities, large portions of northern China, were reduced by proportions that took centuries to recover. The mainstream account frames this as barbarism, as the unleashed violence of a nomadic culture that had no understanding of or respect for settled civilization. There's an element of truth in that framing. The Mongols did emerge from a culture in which the destruction of a rival group's herds, and by extension their capacity for survival, was a legitimate military objective. The logic translated imperfectly and catastrophically to the sacking of cities. But the barbarism narrative is incomplete, because when you examine the actual pattern of Mongol destruction, which cities were destroyed, which were spared, under what conditions each outcome obtained, something becomes visible that pure barbarism cannot explain. The destruction was selective, and the selectivity followed an economic logic that is identifiable and consistent across the entire sweep of the conquests. Cities that surrendered without resistance were generally spared. Not always, and not uniformly. There were exceptions, and the Mongols were not reliable guarantors of their own promises. But the general principle held across dozens of campaigns. Surrendered cities were taxed, their craftsmen were relocated to serve imperial needs, their merchants were incorporated into the Ordos network, their administrative structures were preserved under Mongol oversight. The city continued to function as an economic unit. Its productive capacity was maintained because its productive capacity was the point. Cities that resisted were, in many cases, destroyed so completely that they never recovered. Merv, in what is now Turkmenistan, at the time one of the largest and most prosperous cities in the world, a center of Islamic scholarship and Central Asian trade, with a population estimated at over 1 million people, was annihilated following its resistance to the Mongol invasion in 1221. Nishapur, another major city in Khorasan, was similarly erased. Urgench, the capital of the Khwarezmian Empire, was flooded after its walls were breached, the city deliberately inundated by diverting a nearby river. These were not acts of uncontrolled rage. They were demonstrations. They were case studies sent in advance to the next city down the road, the next ruler calculating whether to resist or submit. The logic was stark and deliberate. Every destroyed city was an advertisement for the cost of resistance, designed to be received by an audience that had not yet made its decision. The Mongols understood something about information, fear, and economic decision-making that modern behavioral economists have since formalized. The most expensive behavior to change is the behavior you have to change through repeated violence. If a prospective opponent could calculate in advance that resistance meant annihilation and submission meant survival and taxation, then resistance became irrational, not morally, not emotionally, but mathematically. The violence, concentrated and catastrophic in the early stages, was designed to eliminate the need for its own continuation. Terror was a front-loaded investment in compliance. This was psychological economic warfare. The terror was the product. The product was compliance. Compliance was taxable. And the tax revenues funded the next campaign. The system was, in its own deeply disturbing way, self-sustaining. The Khwarezmian Empire is worth examining in particular detail here, because it illustrates the full system at work with unusual clarity. In 1218, Genghis Khan sent a trade caravan of roughly 450 merchants to the Khwarezmian Shah, Muhammad II, under the explicit protections of Mongol diplomatic custom. The governor of the border city of Otrar had the caravan seized and its merchants executed, apparently suspecting them of being spies. The Shah endorsed the decision, and when Genghis Khan sent diplomatic envoys to demand accountability, Muhammad had the envoys killed. From a conventional diplomatic standpoint, this was an outrage. From an economic standpoint, it was something more specific. It was a breach of contract in the one domain where the Mongols were most sensitive. Merchant protection was not merely a courtesy. It was the foundation of the Arctic system. It was the guarantee upon which the entire financial architecture of Mongol expansion rested. An empire that could not protect its merchants was an empire that could not finance its campaigns. The attack on the caravan was, in Genghis Khan's calculus, an existential threat to his business model. The response was total. The Mongol campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire between 1219 and 1221 was conducted with a systematic ferocity that was, even by Mongol standards, exceptional. The Shah's empire, which had been, just a decade earlier, the most powerful state in the Islamic world, stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf, was annihilated in roughly 2 years. Its major cities were destroyed one by one. Muhammad II fled and died in exile on an island in the Caspian Sea. His son Jalal ad-Din fought a brilliant rearguard resistance for years, winning several engagements against Mongol forces, before being eventually hunted down and killed. The message of the Khwarezmian campaign was not simply military. It was financial. It said to every trader, every governor, every king who heard it, the Mongol merchant network is protected. The consequences of violating that protection are total and they are permanent. The cost of attacking Mongol commercial interests is the destruction of your civilization. It was, in its way, the most aggressive trade enforcement action in human history. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the borders of Poland and Hungary in the west, from the Siberian taiga in the north to the Persian Gulf in the south. It encompassed what are now more than 30 modern countries. It was the largest contiguous empire in human history, an area so vast that it included every major climate zone, every major religion, every major language family on the Eurasian continent. Administering it required Genghis Khan's successors to move beyond the pure military model and build something more durable. What emerged, particularly under Genghis Khan, Genghis's chosen successor, and later under Kublai Khan in the east and the Ilkhanate rulers in Persia, was one of history's most consequential experiments in multicultural governance. The Mongols, as a rule, were organizational pragmatists. They did not impose their own religion on the peoples they conquered. The Mongol court was famously eclectic, hosting Buddhist monks, Nestorian Christian priests, Muslim scholars, and Taoist philosophers with something approaching genuine intellectual curiosity. They did not impose their own language as the language of administration in territories where that language had no roots. They did not attempt to replace existing bureaucratic structures with Mongol ones, because Mongol culture, for all its military genius, had not developed the administrative traditions of a settled, literate civilization. Instead, they hired the bureaucrats who were already there. Persian administrators, many of them survivors of the very cities the Mongols had conquered, ran the Persian territories. Chinese scholar officials ran China under Kublai Khan, within a framework that borrowed heavily from Chinese imperial tradition. Muslim legal scholars managed the application of law in Islamic territories. Nestorian Christians ran portions of the diplomatic correspondence. The Mongols provided the military framework, enforced the peace, and took their percentage. Everything else was outsourced to local expertise. This was not enlightened tolerance in a modern liberal sense. It was efficiency. Running an empire of this scale required specialized human capital, literacy, numeracy, knowledge of local law and custom and language that the Mongols simply did not possess in sufficient quantity. The pragmatic solution was to acquire it by employing it. The result was a multicultural administrative apparatus that was, by the standards of the era, remarkably functional, and that operated continuously for over a century across a territory that no single cultural tradition had ever managed to govern. Beneath that administrative apparatus ran trade. Enormous, unprecedented, continent-spanning trade that transformed the economic geography of the medieval world. The period that historians call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, lasted roughly from the 1260s to the 1360s, approximately a century during which the overland routes connecting China to Persia, the Black Sea, and ultimately to Europe were more secure, more consistently maintained, and more heavily used than at any point before in recorded history. Marco Polo traveled the Silk Road during this period and found it, by his account, navigable, supplied, and governed. His account is sometimes dismissed as exaggerated or partially invented, but recent scholarship has increasingly validated its broad outlines. The infrastructure was real. The safety was real, at least relative to what preceded and followed it. The Pax Mongolica was not a myth. The Black Death also traveled the Silk Road during this period, a reminder, important and sobering, that connectivity is a neutral force. It amplifies whatever moves through it. The same infrastructure that carried silk, spices, silver, and ideas from China to Venice also carried Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the plague, westward from the rodent populations of Central Asia into the crowded cities of Europe, where it killed approximately one-third of the continent's population between 1347 and 1351. The Mongols built the highway. They had no control over what traveled it. But the economic consequences of the Pax Mongolica extended far beyond the immediate decades of the peace itself, and they are still being fully understood by historians and economists working today. The integration of the Eurasian trade network under Mongol authority transferred not just goods but knowledge, technology, and financial instruments on a scale that had no precedent. Paper money, which the Mongols had adopted from the Chinese Song dynasty and which Kublai Khan famously attempted to impose across the Prost Empire as a universal currency, was one of the most significant of these transfers. The experiment largely failed outside of China. European and Central Asian merchants were deeply resistant to a medium of exchange backed by imperial decree rather than by metal. But the idea traveled west in the minds of the traders who had encountered it, and within 2 centuries, Paper instruments of credit and exchange were becoming central to European commercial life. The bill of exchange, a financial instrument that allowed merchants to conduct transactions across large distances without physically moving metal currency, has deep roots in the trade practices of the Ordic network. The letters of credit, the promissory notes, the formalized debt instruments that became the backbone of Italian Renaissance banking and that ultimately seeded the development of modern financial markets, were conceptually downstream from the financial innovations that the Mongol trade network made necessary and then made standard. The silver that flowed along Mongol trade routes from the mines of Central Asia and China restructured the monetary systems of the Middle East and Europe. The agricultural techniques that diffused through Mongol-administered corridors, new crop varieties, new irrigation methods, new approaches to animal husbandry, changed what people ate across multiple continents. The gunpowder that Chinese engineers brought to Mongol service, and that traveled west in the knowledge carried by merchants and diplomats along the Silk Road, fundamentally altered the military and eventually the political history of Europe. The Mongols did not just connect the world for a century. They mixed it. They took the knowledge, the capital, the disease, the technology, the agricultural practice, and the financial innovation that had been developing separately in China, in the Islamic world, in Persia, in South Asia, and they scrambled it together in a single vast network through which all of it moves simultaneously. What emerged from that scrambling, slowly and imperfectly and at enormous human cost, was something recognizably modern. The Renaissance, in its intellectual and commercial dimensions, is difficult to imagine without the century of Eurasian integration that the Mongol Empire made possible. There is one final dimension of Genghis Khan's strategy that deserves its own careful examination: the psychological architecture of his reputation, and the way that reputation functioned as a form of capital that was deliberately constructed, maintained, and deployed. Genghis Khan was among the first rulers in human history to understand and to act systematically on the understanding that reputation was a strategic resource with measurable economic value. The stories that spread ahead of his armies were not merely the natural byproduct of the violence. They were, in many cases, actively cultivated. Survivors of destroyed cities were sometimes deliberately released and sent toward the next target, carrying first-hand accounts of what they had witnessed. The psychological distance between what people feared and what had actually happened was managed carefully, kept as wide as the facts would allow. A ruler's reputation is a form of capital. It is stored not in a treasury, but in the distributed cognition of everyone who's heard the stories. And in a world without mass media, without printing, without telecommunications, word of mouth was the only broadcast network available. The Mongols used it with a sophistication that most modern analysts of information warfare would recognize. Every city that was destroyed contributed not just to the fear of the next city, but to the economic calculus of every ruler within earshot. If the cost of resistance was annihilation, total, documented, historically verified annihilation, and the cost of submission was a tax and the loss of sovereignty, but the retention of life, property, and commercial function, then the decision tree was clear. Resistance was irrational. Submission was rational. And the Mongols needed their opponents to be rational, because irrational opponents were expensive. The psychological pressure this reputation exerted reduced the military cost of expansion in ways that are difficult to quantify precisely, but that were clearly significant. Campaigns that might have required years of siege operations and major pitched battles, the kind of campaigns that had exhausted previous conquerors, were compressed, in case after case, into negotiations followed by swift submission. The reputation of absolute incredible terror, carefully maintained across decades, paid for itself many times over in reduced military expenditure. In this sense, Genghis Khan understood something that modern game theorists and economists have since formalized in the language of credible commitment and Reputation equilibria. In a repeated game against many different opponents who can observe each other's outcomes, the cost of establishing an absolutely credible threat is worth paying in full, early, because it reduces the cost of every subsequent interaction. The total destruction of the first few cities that resisted, the Nishapur, the Zhongdu, the Urgench, was not a failure of restraint or moderation. It was a calculated investment in the credibility of a threat that would, if sufficiently established, never need to be executed again. The violence was the advertisement. The advertisement was for peace on Mongol terms. And peace on Mongol terms was an extraordinarily profitable business. Genghis Khan died in 1227 during a campaign against the Xia kingdom in what is now the Ningxia region of northwestern China. The cause of his death remains genuinely uncertain. The Mongols kept no detailed records of the event, deliberately, to prevent enemies from exploiting the transition of power. Some sources suggest wounds sustained during the campaign. Others point to illness. He was somewhere between 60 and 65 years old, which was, by the standards of a life spent in constant military campaigning in one of the world's harshest physical environments, a remarkably long life. He was buried in an unmarked grave in Mongolia, the location kept secret by his inner circle. 40 slaves who had witnessed the burial were reportedly killed to preserve the secret, as were the soldiers who had killed the slaves. The grave has never been found. He left behind an empire that covered more than 24 million square kilometers, more than twice the size of the Roman Empire at its greatest extent. He left behind a succession structure built around the principle of Kurultai election among the senior male descendants of the imperial line, a structure that would have, within 2 generations, produced the fragmentation of the empire into the competing Khanates of the Golden Horde, the Il Khanate, the Chagatai Khanate, and the Yuan dynasty in China. He left behind a trade network that would outlast the political unity of the empire by decades. And he left behind a methodology, a coherent, internally consistent set of ideas about logistics, financial architecture, meritocratic organization, and the strategic deployment of terror that influenced every empire that came after it. The Ottoman sultans, in their own expansion across Anatolia and into Europe, studied Mongol administrative methods and adapted several of them. The Safavid dynasty in Persia rebuilt the Persian state on foundations that were, in part, the ruins of Mongol administration. Tamerlane, who devastated Central Asia in the late 14th century and who was, by the standards of any era, an enormously destructive conqueror, explicitly identified himself as an heir of the Mongol tradition, invoking Genghis Khan's legacy as a source of his own legitimacy and modeling his campaigns, including the deliberate use of large-scale destruction as a deterrent on Mongol precedent. Even the Russian concept of centralized autocratic power, the tradition of the Tsar as absolute sovereign above the law and the church, bears the deep imprint of the 2.5 centuries during which the Russian principalities existed as vassals of the Golden Horde, paying tribute and absorbing administrative practices that had Mongol roots. The world the Mongols made was not the world they intended to make. No empire ever produces exactly the legacy it plans for. But the world that emerged from the century of Mongol dominion over the Eurasian heartland, the connected, commercially integrated, intellectually cross-pollinated world of the late medieval period, was shaped by their work in ways that are still present in the geography of global trade, in the architecture of international finance, and in the political structures of a dozen modern states. What Genghis Khan built was not simply an empire in the traditional historical sense. It was a proof of concept, a demonstration that with sufficient organizational genius, with the right financial architecture, with a clear-eyed and unsentimental understanding of human psychology and economic incentive, the barriers to scale, the logistical, financial, and psychological barriers that had stopped every conqueror before him were not fixed features of reality. They were solvable problems. And solved problems, once solved, stay solved. He solved the logistics of terror by making terror logistically efficient, by systematizing its application, regulating its distribution, and calibrating its intensity to produce compliance rather than merely destruction. He solved the funding problem of perpetual expansion by turning merchants into investment partners and conquered peoples into functional components of the machine that had conquered them, giving them a stake in the system's operation that was, at minimum, economically preferable to resistance. He solved the problem of governing a multicultural empire at continental scale by outsourcing the work of governance to the cultures themselves, maintaining Mongol monopoly control over force, while allowing the administrative expertise of each conquered civilization to run its own affairs within the imperial framework. These are not exclusively medieval ideas. They are patterns. They recur, in various forms and with various moral valences, in the history of every large organization, every empire, every corporation, every political movement that has ever attempted to grow faster than its existing resources would seem to allow. Because the fundamental problem Genghis Khan solved was not a uniquely Mongol problem. It was the universal problem of scale. How does ambition outrun capacity? And what happens when someone figures out how to close that gap? The answer, as Genghis Khan demonstrated across 4 decades in the continent, is that it reshapes the world. The reshaping is never clean. It is never just. The cost in human life and suffering of the Mongol conquest was enormous and real, and should not be minimized or aestheticized. But the reshaping is thorough, and it lasts for a very long time. The story of Genghis Khan is often told as a story of destruction. And it is that. But it is also, if you look at the full arc, the financial architecture, the logistical innovation, the trade networks, the administrative pragmatism, the century of connected commerce that followed, a story about what happens when the capacity for organized violence is married to a genuine understanding of economic systems. What happens is an empire. What remains, long after the empire is gone, is the world it built in spite of itself.